Gone with the Wind is based on a wildly popular novel from Margaret Mitchell that was a bestseller in the 1930s. And David O. Selznick bought the rights to it and then began production in the late 1930s, and such a production it was. 59 leading and supporting actors, 2,400 extras, 90 sets that use nearly 1 million board feet of lumber, $3 million in costs, over $100,000 in women's costumes alone, and another $1 million on prints, publicity, and advertising. And this is the Great Depression, the end of the Great Depression that we're talking about here. And it's, you know, an epic, if there ever was one, of American filmmaking. It embraces hook, line, and sinker this lost cause myth in a lot of its imagery. Now, it's not as overt as Birth of a Nation. And, you know, the studio was careful not, you know, they didn't want to be as offensive as Griffith's portrayal of Southern blacks had been. They leave out some of Mitchell's more inflammatory, incendiary depictions of blacks. In the novel, she wrote this: "Freed slaves were like monkeys or small children turned loose among treasured objects whose value is beyond their comprehension. Here was the astonishing spectacle of half a nation attempting, at the point of a bayonet, to force upon the other half the rule of Negroes, many of them scarcely one generation out of the African jungles." That's in Gone with the Wind. It's not in the film, it's in the novel. In the novel itself, of course, the very beginning of it, let me just show you the very opening. It pretty much sets the stage for the tenor of the film itself. And if you've never seen Gone with the Wind, it's a fabulous movie, a visual spectacle coming out of 1939. It is over 3 hours in length, and it follows Scarlett O'Hara and Rhett Butler through the Civil War, and then the burning and sacking of Atlanta, and then the very painful period of having to pick up the pieces after their world, this great world, is destroyed here, the Terra. So let me get the opening scene here of Gone with the Wind. Sets it up right there. The bucolic, as I said, mint juleps in the moonlight, lost, heroic age that is on forever. In the film, you see African Americans are, the slaves that are depicted in the film are docile, or they're stereotyped. There are, and of course, the big, huge, largest shot of all, you have 1,500 extras in this, in which you see, and I'll show it to you. In fact, let's watch it right now. It's a great scene. Pharisees falling. The blacks who are in the film are, and there are a handful of them, they're servants of the family, and you've got Prissy, played by Butterfly McQueen there on the right, who is stereotyped and is hysterical most of the time. Or you've got Big Sam up there in the left corner, who is a docile field hand, loyal field hand, and then you've got Pork down there on the right, the butler. They're all incredibly loyal to the O'Hara family. They're incredibly loyal to the Southern cause. In fact, this scene here is very telling, in which Scarlett is in Atlanta, and the plantation slaves are now being marched through the streets to go out and build earthworks for the Confederates during the siege. Journalistic family in which the slaves happily are going to go out cheerfully and dig earthworks to prevent the Yankees from destroying the system that enslaves them. It's, again, another central element of this lost cause myth that is thoroughly influencing and propelling Gone with the Wind throughout. Later, there's a scene of a free black who is aligned with another one of these evil white carpetbaggers who has no use for Southern blacks, no use for the Southern whites, depicted very negatively. The film is remarkable because Hattie McDaniel, who played Mammy, Scarlett's maid, is going to be the first African American to win an Academy Award for her role as Mammy here in this film. Hattie McDaniel will win the Oscar in 1939, or it'll be in 1940. The film came out in late 1939. Although it's interesting because when the film premiered in Atlanta, she was barred from going to the film's premiere with the other main actors because of her skin color. The theater was segregated, and she was not allowed to attend, even though she's going to win the Academy Award for her performance. A lot of blacks criticized her for that performance because it was all the stereotypes that we might imagine of a black mammy in this bucolic, lost, heroic South. Gone with the Wind, still around. In 1976, when it premiered on network television for the first time, it garnered still the largest audience ever, television audience ever, to watch it. And we also have this in our library, too. Woo! That's right. Moving ahead here, 1940s and 50s, golden age of Westerns. The Civil War, there aren't a lot of epic or big pictures specifically about the Civil War. There are a handful. What there are a couple of interesting films that come out that are based on pieces of literature about the Civil War, similar to Gone with the Wind. In 1951, The Red Badge of Courage appears, based on a Stephen Crane novel from the late 19th century. And there's another very interesting film that I would draw your attention to. You maybe not have heard of it before, but it's actually a French film, French-made film, based on the Ambrose Bierce short story called Incident at Owl Creek Bridge. It runs all of 25 minutes, but it won the Oscar in 1963 for Best Short Film. The Red Badge of Courage comes out in 1951, and if you don't know the story, it's about a Union soldier who actually goes off to battle, ready to fight, all heroic-like and stuff, and then when the shells start exploding and the Confederates start charging, he loses his nerve and runs off. And then later, the next day, regains his courage and will then redeem himself. It's notable because it starred Audie Murphy. I don't know if any of you, probably many of you were older enough who Audie Murphy was, but Audie Murphy was the most decorated United States combat soldier in World War II, and then he became a Hollywood actor. So it's an interesting, as I said, an interesting portrayal. As I said, in 1962, this film came out, the incident at Owl Creek, or an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. And if I told you what happens, it would spoil everything, but it's about the hanging of a Confederate spy behind Union lines off of the Owl Creek Bridge. Fascinating short story, fascinating little vignette as well. The occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Okay, moving ahead here a little bit. When the Vietnam era came upon us, films, there's a pretty sparse era for Civil War themed films. World War II was more in focus. Civil War simply was not something that filmmakers were dealing with, or they might be dealing with it on a, as I said, like a tangential level. The spaghetti westerns all deal with people who had been involved in the Civil War, but the Civil War is not front and center. I actually watched a movie yesterday, and some of you may have seen this movie or know this movie. It's a Jimmy Stewart movie called Shenandoah. It came out in 1965 about a Virginian with his sons, grown sons. His wife's deceased, and he's got a daughter and some grown sons and a young son, I think 6 sons or so. And they live in the Shenandoah Valley right in the middle of the Civil War. All these battles are happening around them, and he manages to keep his sons out of the conflict. And it's interesting. It comes out in 1965, right when we were escalating our efforts in Vietnam, and the anti-war movement correspondingly was beginning to escalate here in the United States. the film has a decidedly anti-war slant to it. And I hadn't, when I first saw it as a kid and was influenced as a kid, I never really put two and two together. Between the 1970s and the 1990s, you start seeing the crack in the veneer, and you start seeing a handful of films beginning to appear, particularly those films that are incorporating new avenues of inquiry and research in the historical community. The 1960s was certainly an era of tumult and upheaval, and that was also the case in the academy, in the universities. Black Americans began demanding that more of their history be taught and more of their scholarship be legitimized, and that we need to go back and find out what actually happened in the past, and no more of this "oh, gone with the wind" myth that has been crammed down our throats forever. In fact, Malcolm X will write in his autobiography how he had to walk out of the screening of Gone with the Wind when he first saw it. He was so offended by the portrayal of these docile blacks who simply agreed to be enslaved and don't resist. More African American scholarship that begins to come out of the era. More interest on women's role, women's history, women's roles in the past, and specifically in the Civil War era, will start to be published. And so you start seeing this new scholarship make its way into the world of big budget films. There is a film that comes out notable for the fact that it stars, one of the stars is Jewel, the singer. She's a much better singer than she is an actress, by the way. It's called Ride with the Devil. But it focused on actually the conflict out in Kansas, the brutality of the border war out in Kansas, and the atrocities against civilian populations who were caught in the crossfire in the early stages of the war. Of course, Cold Mountain, another big budget movie, comes out in 2003, dealing with a variety of issues, but one of the centerpiece issues is women, the role of women, Southern women on the home front who don't live in the plantations, the sort of poor women who are living up to hill country in North Carolina. It opens with a very stunning battle scene of the battle at what came to be called the Crater, at the siege outside of Petersburg, in which Union sappers and miners dug a trench underneath the Confederate lines. They were simply siege lines around Petersburg, and dynamited an enormous amount of dynamite, blowing a huge hole in the Confederate lines that looked like a volcanic crater when it first occurred. Union soldiers had charged into it, and instead of charging around it, they charged right down into it, and then it was just a slaughterhouse. Very entertaining opening scene in Cold Mountain. In the mid-1990s, Ted Turner decided he was going to do the Civil War, and he took two pieces of literature, Gettysburg by Michael Schirra, which is based on a fine novel about the Gettysburg conflict called The Killer Angels, and then his son, Jeff Schirra, wrote sort of a prequel to that called Gods and Generals. And then Turner also financed a movie based on the notorious prisoner of war camp, Confederate prisoner of war camp at Andersonville. And so Turner is involved heavily in promoting these films. They're fine films, especially Gettysburg and Gods and Generals, if you like battle scene after battle scene after battle scene. Gods and Generals, I don't know how long that thing is, but I remember seeing it in the theater, and there's an intermission. They don't have intermissions in movies anymore, but in Gods and Generals, they do. And then in 1989, this film appeared, Glory. And I want to talk a little bit about Glory here and show you a clip from it, because I think what you see is the lost cause myth has gone nearly full circle with this film. The central question in the Civil War era in the North, one of the central questions is, will the Negro fight? And for the first couple of years, Lincoln is reluctant about allowing the enlistment of free Northern blacks into the units, into the fighting units, because he feared primarily peeling off border state sentiment, who would then gravitate towards the Confederacy. Lincoln had said all along this was a war to restore the Union, not a war necessarily on slavery. Increasingly, however, when it becomes clear that the North is going to have to marshal all of its resources to win this titanic struggle, he will then begin allowing, in the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation, the enlistment of black soldiers. Glory is going to follow loosely the exploits of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, and it's led by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, and it stars Morgan Freeman and a young Denzel Washington.